Good for you. By the way, everyone, this is David, our cameraman, who is in Florida, running the camera. But he's also one of my best friends and allies in this great metaphysical journey that, in fact, interestingly enough, just to give you a bit of history about me, I actually started reading cards about a little over 40 years ago. And my first deck of cards I bought while with my friend David, and I was in my teens at that time, and I got the Rider-Waite deck, got the Rider-Waite book, and also A.E. Waite, who was really not an easy read, I must say. And that began what has become a very, very, very long journey. So I've been at it for, over 40 years, and I can tell you, you will never get tired of it. It's an amazing system for meditation, for divination, for all sorts of things. Okay? And today is going to be particularly dense. Tomorrow will be less so, because tomorrow we're going to be covering the major arcana. And the best way to learn the major arcana is in the form of story. So that will actually be in some ways a little easier. Today we have to look at the overall structure of tarot. Now, some of the people in the room here I know have been around with me for years and have actually a fair level of knowledge. You actually know quite a bit about tarot. So hopefully hearing all this basic stuff won't bore you to death, but I think it's very important to go back to the basics often. So I'm hoping it'll be worthwhile for you. Others in the room, this is a totally new subject. This course is designed to get you up to speed. So here's what I want to say about tarot, just from the get-go. There are two ways to learn tarot. The first is you get a deck and you get a book and you look at a card and you read the book and you try to memorize the meaning. There are 22 trumps. There are, I forget how many lesser arcana, 10 of each. 56, thank you. 56 lesser arcana. It can take you a very long time. And it's what I call the dummy method of learning tarot. So I don't want you to do that. I want you to be able to walk out of this room at the end of this weekend and have a system in your head so that you can figure out any card at any time. And that's my real hope for how we're going to do this. In order to do that, I'm going to have to blow through a lot of other things. We're going to have to talk about planets. We're going to have to talk about numbers. We're going to have to talk about the Kabbalistic tree of life. You're going to have to talk about all of that, because once you understand the basics of those systems, you can figure out any card. And that's what you really need. Because otherwise you'll spend half your life memorizing cards and really, frankly, missing the depth and the complexity of the system. So what is tarot, first of all, and where did it come from? Well, that is one of those things that nobody really knows. The apocryphal stories are, they came from ancient Egypt, and what they did is they codified all of the great, archetypes of knowledge in the form of these symbols, so that when the library at Alexandria was burned, that all knowledge would not be lost. Well, I'd like to think that our humans are that forward thinking. I doubt it. We haven't figured that out yet. Maybe they were smarter back then. I don't know. What we do know, though, is that when you look at the iconography of the trumps, which is probably the core, really, of the tarot system, that these are very, very, very old symbols. But they are composite symbols. So in other words, they got added to as centuries went on. Certainly they came out of Egypt to some degree, then they passed through Greece, they picked up a lot of Judaic symbolism from Kabbalah, then they went through the whole Renaissance and revival of magic. They were then reworked yet again, probably in the early 20th century, late 19th century, by the magicians of the Golden Dawn and others, the Rosicrucians. And so we get this final form. So these are composite symbols. I don't really know that the history matters very much, although it's kind of fun. It's one of those geeky things that people like to study. But what I can tell you is it is a very carefully constructed system of archetypes. Archetypes, what are archetypes? Archetypes are symbols that are actually, they're not symbols, they're beyond symbols. Symbols point to something. Archetypes actually have a whole complex of ideas and energies that exist somehow outside of one mind. They exist in the consciousness of all of us. So when you are in the presence of a great archetype, even if it's from a wildly different culture than your own, you feel it. You feel something. You have an intuitive sense of what that thing means. These are great archetypes. And what they allow us to do what the system is really fundamentally about is they give you a key for allowing yourself to trigger your own internal knowing, your own intuition, in order to arrive at knowledge. So, for example, let's say you're going through a period of transition and there's a lot of stuff up in the air and you're trying to kind of figure out, am I doing the right thing? Am I moving in the right direction? You could do a tarot reading, and it isn't so much about saying what the future is. It's about explaining to you or allowing you to get in contact with your own inner knowledge about what energy is at work in you at that time. It's a very powerful way of actually getting in touch. It's also, so it's a meditation. It is a way actually of divining, meaning, let's say someone comes to you with a big question. This is a person who, is going through something and really wants some information, wants some guidance, which is an interesting thing, because anybody who reads tarot as I do will also tell you, don't try to read for yourself. I mean, I use the cards often as a meditation device, but reading for yourself, it's like trying to interpret your own dreams. You're so inside it, So it's always useful to have somebody else throw the cards for you. What happens when that's done? Well, what happens is the cards come out in what seems like a random manner. Except that, of course, what we believe is that there's never anything very random about the universe. There's a kind of synchronicity at work. So the cards come out in a certain pattern, and it's the symbols, especially the trumps, but all of the symbols stimulate the own intuitive knowing of the person who's doing the reading. And one of the things that's interesting about doing a tarot reading is there are people like, I actually am pretty intuitive, and I can be quite psychic if I push myself. So, for example, I, at one point in my magical training, had to learn to do readings from totally wild, random things, like the pattern of a fly crawling across the wall. Read that. Throw a handful of twigs. Read that. You can get really good readings doing that. But if you're somebody who likes intellectual systems, as I do, it makes you very nervous. I love tarot because it is an intellectual system, and there is it sort of frees you up, because there's so much information there that you don't have to worry about, oh my gosh, am I making this up? Is my intuition, on? Am I running away with myself? So it's really, in a sense, not only does it stimulate our inner knowing, but for those of us who are self-doubters and second-guessers, it's also a really wonderful way to kind of be a prop, so that you don't get so nervous about actually letting yourself go out there. But I can tell you, one of the things that happens when you read the cards is that you begin to look at patterns, and knowledge and meaning will begin to emerge. And sometimes knowledge will begin to come through that really has no basis in the cards at all, or very little. For example, I always love reading for strangers, because when you're reading for a stranger, there's nothing in the way. It's just pure, here it is, here's the pattern, what do I think? But things can happen. So for example, I had a woman, this was many years ago, who came, who wanted a reading, and she was in a relationship, and she wanted to know more about that relationship, and I threw the cards, and I started the reading, and as I got into the pattern, I just began to know stuff. So I looked, and the card for the devil came up, which has many meanings, one of which, and only one of which, is addictive process. The moment I looked at that card, I said, oh, you're involved in a relationship with a man who's a cocaine addict. And then I went off on this whole riff, all of which turned out to be absolutely accurate. That does happen. It does happen. And if it happens, I encourage you to just let it fly, let it come through. Something's downloading, But the nice thing is you don't have to be having one of those wildly psychic moments. You can get a perfectly good, competent reading just by sticking with the information from the cards. So you're going to be learning a lot about how to do that. But the first thing is you have to understand the system. So let's talk about that. Here's what we're going to do today. We're going to talk about the structure of the deck, the lesser arcana, the major arcana, the court cards. We're going to talk also about the four suits and how they relate to the four elements. You have a million handouts, so hopefully you won't have to take a million notes. It's actually, most of it's written down for you. And we're going to talk about the four worlds, and we're going to talk about the tree of life, because the cards fit on the tree of life. That's the master system. Actually, I have to tell you, if you really begin to get into this method of learning, and you're really interested in Hermetic knowledge or Western mysticism at all, you will ultimately become a Kabbalist. Because by learning Kabbalah, you have the key to pretty much, it is the key for almost all of Western metaphysics. So that's an interesting thing. But you're going to get not a whole Kabbalistic lecture, but you're going to get a good start on it. The parts that are germane to what we're doing this weekend. Tomorrow we're going to focus completely on the trumps. And it'll take us all day to get through the trumps. Because unfortunately they're not as easy, they're not as accessible in the sense that with the lesser arcana, we can put together, okay, it's a 4, okay, it's this suit, okay, that has to do with, and then you've got a meaning, So, but the trumps are much more complex because they are great archetypes. So they are what they are in and of themselves. And the best way to learn them is to learn about the icons that form them, to learn the stories behind them. So for example, we'll talk tomorrow at great length about the Tower. Tower is one of the scarier cards. I think most of you probably seen it. It's the picture of the lightning flash coming down, smacking the top of the tower, and the two bodies flying out. And everybody, whenever that card comes up in a reading, people kind of go, But actually, if you begin to look at the iconography and the stories that underlie that symbol, it begins to become not so scary at all. So, for example, one of the stories that underlies the tower is about the Tower of Babel. Right? Remember that story from the Bible where, so the people of earth decide they're going to build a tower all the way up to heaven, which of course is symbolic of our attempting to understand the complexity of God, to really have an intellectual edifice that explains the universe. Well, we try to do that. We do try to do that as humans pretty much all the time. And so they're building up this tower, and God looks down and goes, what a bunch of morons. And blam, strikes the whole thing down. Down it falls, right? And what happens then? Well, what happens then is when the tower falls down, also everybody is struck by glossolalia, which is speaking in tongues. And suddenly, nobody speaks the same language as anybody else. So, of course, it's very chaotic because everybody's speaking in different languages. But another way of looking at that, really, is that it's the beginning of a greater complexity. So what we do when we take and build up ideas is we create structures to describe reality. Then inspiration comes along, or some moment comes along that is not able to be contained within that structure that we built up. It's too big for it. This happens to all of us. I'm sure you've all had these moments, right? And then suddenly, blam, the whole house of cards falls down, right? And at first it feels like, oh my God, I don't understand anything anymore. It's this completely confusing. But in fact, what happens is once the dust settles, is now you have multiplicity. You have more languages. You have more ways of understanding. You have a broader symbol system. The Tower is really a card of initiation. That's only one of the stories that underlies that card. But once you get the story, it's unforgettable. Right? So we're going to be talking about them in that way. All right. So let's just dive in. Now, you have on your laps a vast series of handouts. Where's my handout? Oh dear, I did have one. The question is what I did with it. Can I borrow? Yeah. So let me orient you to these because we're going to be flipping back and forth through them. You may want to unstaple them or you may not. That's up to you. The first packet is this one. And what I did is, we won't get to this until this afternoon. What I did is basically gave you a lot of information on the Tree of Life and on planets and symbols. And this is mostly just a reference guide for you so that when you go home and you think, now what was that thing she was talking about? There it is. All right. What we will be looking at a lot is, I thought it would be easier if we all had pictures of the cards that were quick and easy to look at. So you have the major arcana, and then we have a Tree of Life, which you will be looking at, and then you have another Tree of Life. Isn't this gorgeous? This is the Tree of Life that shows where the trumps are on the tree. So I thought it would be fun to have one of those.
Do you have trumps What comes?
Major arcana.
Okay,
Major arcana. Yeah. What's an arcana? Well, it actually isn't an arcana, it's an arcanum, the plural being arcana. It's a Latin word. An arcanum is a bit of sacred knowledge. It's a bit of sacred knowledge. So the major arcana are what we also call the trumps. These are big cards that symbolize states of being, right? States of being. And we'll talk about that in a minute. Then there's another little tree. This is a beautiful little tree. I put this in because this is actually the Judaic Kabbalah. So there are some differences primarily in spelling and somewhat in conception, because the Kabbalah as it's practiced in Judaism is really much more of a system of prayer, worship, and understanding God, as opposed to what we're going to be using it in a more psychological context. Then we have the minor arcana. Those are what we call the suits. So that's just to give you an idea of the handouts, and so now I hope you sort of have a vague idea of where stuff is, and we'll be looking, and I'll direct you as we go. So let's talk first about structure, and that was the question that Judith just asked. So what are the trumps, and what are the lesser arcana? Well, first of all, there are three parts that you really have to understand. You have the trumps, or the major arcana. They are a 0, that being the first card, 0, the Fool, through 21. So there are 22 of these great archetypes. These archetypes, when they appear in a reading, symbolize states of being, or transitions, or major initiations. And when they show up, something's at work in your life that you just have to get on board with, because you cannot manipulate it. You got to go with it. So when a trump appears, what it tells you is, okay, hold your hat, Nelly, and batten down the hatches, because here you go. You can't stop the movement of one of these arcana. They're huge. These are forces beyond our manipulation. And they show up in our lives when we are in really in important nodes, important moments where we're transferring our energy, where we're going from one state to another, or where we're really in full flow. They represent major growth periods, major unfoldings within the self, which is why we use them quite a bit in mystery school. When we enter a new phase, a new season, or a new cycle, one of the things that we often do is each person will draw an arcana, a trump, a major arcana. And that gives you a sense of like, okay, so what's the next cycle going to be about for me? So that's one way that you can use the trumps. One of the things that I would encourage you to do, actually, especially after tomorrow, is every day to just take the trumps out of your deck and draw one. Just as, okay, so what's it going to be like today, And so if you pull a trump and read about it, remind yourself, what it's about, and then go through your day, and then at the end of the day, check in and say, okay, so how did that relate? How did that work today? It's a good way to kind of keep learning the cards, but it's also a really interesting meditation for setting the tone for a day. So those are your trumps. Then we have the lesser arcana, which is sort of divided into two parts. The number cards, which are the ace is 1, and then you have 2 through 10. So 1 through 10. And then you have what we call the court cards. Now, if you think about a playing card deck today, a modern deck, you basically, what you have is tarot deck without the greater arcana. That's what you have. And so if you think about it, you have 4 suits, right? So you have spades, which is actually swords, which is easy to remember if you know Latin or Italian, because the word for sword is spades, spade. So you have swords or spades. You have wands, also sometimes called batons in French decks. And in the modern deck, it would be clubs. Whack somebody over the head with a stick. It's a club, right? Hearts are cups. And that's easy to remember because the suit of cups is all about emotions. And diamonds are pentacles, which are also sometimes in some decks called coins. So that's your four suits. Just like, and in fact, when people read playing cards, there are some people who do that, gypsy fortune tellers and so forth. What they're basically doing is, you could, if you know the lesser arcana, you can pick up any playing card deck and do that type of a reading. You just don't have the trumps. So that would be sort of sad. But the four suits represent points of activity, day-to-day events, right? Actions, influences. One way to think of them is like if the greater trumps, the greater arcana, are forces that you simply are carried away by and that you have to work with. These lesser arcana, we can actually kind of manipulate quite a bit. And I always liken it to thinking about weather systems, okay? So there's the big weather, volcanic eruptions, earthquakes, deluges. Not a lot you can do about that. You just sort of have to adjust and work with it. And then there's, the lesser arcana. Got a little rain today, got a little sleet, got a little snow, hotter than heck, but, it's stuff that it's more normal. It's day-to-day events, day-to-day activity, things that you can really manipulate. And so that's the lesser arcana. And then you have, among the lesser arcana, you have the four suits. These suits indicate the area of life or the realm in which the activity is taking place. So, for example, if I have, going back to my sort of silly weather metaphor, if I have a little rain falling in my pentacles, what I have is probably some small financial problems. If on the other hand, it's been raining for, a week, and the basement is flooding, then it's, boy, maybe I overdrew my checking account, that sort of thing. If on the other hand, something is happening in the suit of cups, it's probably not so much about finances and physical things, it's more about emotions. And so we'll talk about that right now a little bit. So let's talk about what the four suits are. So you have wands. Wands is associated with fire. And it's also associated with action, the impulse to do stuff, and the quality of it. So whether we're really gung-ho or whether we're in a moment of pause. And it often reflects the pace of events and whether or not we're encountering a lot of resistance. So for example, sometimes when you're really on a project and you're really going, you just keep coming up against things that get in the way. And eventually you sort of say, geez, I feel like I'm pushing the river here, And that would probably be, maybe the Seven of Wands. But at any rate, there's that way where you're pushing. And then other times you could have the Seven of Pentacles actually indicates pause, where there's a pause in activity. So it's all about, wands are all about activity. And as we talk about the individual cards, we're going to go through each one. And so you'll get more information. But that would be fire. And fire also, in a higher sense, which we're going to talk about in a moment, has to do with the primal, with the higher spiritual level, with initiation and creation. So one of the things that wands is about is actually how in touch are we with whatever it was that got us going in the first place. So how you start on a project and you've got a really clear vision, you really are ready to charge out and do that thing. And then as time goes on, that either gets grounded and becomes more solid, or sometimes it dissipates. All of that would be wands. So it has to do with that. The next suit, which is cups, has to do with water. So we're getting into our four elements, fire, water. And it has to do with emotions and receptivity and very much relationships. So when you get a reading that has a ton of cups in it, then you automatically go, okay, so this is either about, some big emotional thing that the person is working through inwardly, or it's about their relationships to others. But that's the realm that it's happening in. And then we have air, which would be swords. And swords is about mind. how we think about things. So if cups is about how we feel about things, swords is about how we think about things. And it has to do with our vision of things. Our states of mind. So for example, the Nine of Swords is often depicted as a woman sitting up in bed in the middle of the night like this. And we've all had that moment, right? Those Nine of Swords moment where you wake up in the middle of the night and you go, ah! You know, and you just have one of those little like anxiety bursts where you're like, oh my goodness, what am I doing? Right. Well, that's the Nine of Swords. So all the different swords, all the different cards have to do with either how you're thinking about things or what your thoughts are or your state of mind, as opposed to your state of feeling. And that's an interesting thing. There is a difference. So even though we think of anxiety as a feeling, it actually is a mental activity. It is, because we're up there spinning our wheels. We're thinking, ruminating and all of that. All right, and so that would be swords in a very quick sense. The final suit, which is pentacles, has to do with matters of money, of the home, and also your body. Now, before I go on and say more about that, I want to just talk a little bit about the four suits again. And I want to say a very basic thing about cards that you need to kind of keep in your mind. So every card has both a negative and a positive meaning. There's no such thing as, oh, this is a good card, or oh, that's a bad card. There's no such thing. Every card has within it a positive and a negative meaning. Some are a little more in one direction than the other, right? But, and I'll talk about that when we talk about the Tree of Life, because the further you get down the Tree of Life, the more imbalance tends to occur. But there is no such thing as a purely negative card. And so how do you determine? One of the things that people do is they shuffle the cards up in such a way that some of them are upside down. These are called reversals. And so if a card comes up reversed, you give it its negative meaning. Again, I don't like this. I think it's too arbitrary, and it's kind of a beginner's trick. It has to do with not really being able to read context. So I would discourage you from doing that. I think it will hamstring your ability to actually read, layouts. We're going to spend a whole day, the third day of this class, on layouts, and that's where you put it all together. That's the real art form. So I would really, I would encourage you not to get into the habit of reading reversals. It's basically kind of a crutch, and it's a crutch that will not serve you. So how do you determine whether a card has its positive or its negative meaning? Well, there are a number of ways. One of the things that gives a sense of the card is the combination of the number of the card and its element. So for example, this is jumping ahead a little bit, but when we talk about fours, we're going to talk about fours as coming into states of stability where things are very defined. And for swords, which represents thought, this is a good thing. Stable thought, meditation. This is generally a fairly positive combination. On the other hand, Four of Cups, not so much, because emotions like to flow. They don't like to be held in boxes. So there's an example where a card is more likely to be positive or negative, but still, you have to look at where the card is in the layout. You have to look at its context. So for example, if you have a Four of Cups, which is about having to kind of stop and put emotions on hold, and it's in a reading where all the other cards are pointing to a need for inner reflection, that's a positive thing, right? So you really have to look at the context. You also have to look at the position on the tree, which we'll talk about when we get to that. So this is an important thing to understand. This afternoon we're going to go through all the cards individually. And one of the things that I'm going to do is I'm going to give you some quick ideas about the positive and the negative for each card. So hopefully you'll have some, like a little cheat sheet for yourself.
Althea,
Yes.
you say that to determine if it's positive or negative, you use a combination of the number of the card
Yes.
and the element. What do you mean by element?
Ah, good question. Element, suit. So each suit is an element, right? Let's review that again really quickly. Swords is air, right? Wands is fire. Cups is water. Pentacles is earth. Very important that you remember that. That'll be easier to remember though in a minute when I actually go through all that stuff. So that's an important kind of thing. All right, and I want to talk about that. Now, at this point, I think what we're going to need to do is start to talk about the Tree of Life. Oh boy. So, turn to your handouts, right? This is the Tree of Life. So you have this beautiful little handout with 10 spheres on it. And of course, there's a sphere that's actually on here that you can't see. It's called the invisible Sephira, which is why you can't see it. Also known as dot. And if you actually turn to the page right after that, you see they put the invisible Sephira in. So for those of you who have a hard time seeing invisible objects, if you look at the second page, there is our invisible Sephira, right? It's known as the abyss. And what's interesting is, looking at that second page for a moment, what do you notice that's different? Well, what you should notice is that there's a perfect sort of symmetry going down the tree. And it's a really interesting thing. One of the ideas that they had is that who is they? All right, let's back up. Sorry, let's back up. Go back to this first page. So, what is this system? Where did it come from? This comes from Judaism. It's from a system called Kabbalah, which is spelled a variety of ways. My favorite being the abbreviation QBL. It's also spelled like this, and like this, and a variety of other weird ways. This is what happens when you take a language and try to transliterate it. And Chinese is the same way. Those of you who know Chinese medicine know it's a nightmare because you have characters and you're trying to translate them into it. Yeah, it doesn't work. Anyway, various ways that we spell it. What Kabbalah is a description of how the universe came into being. It's also a description of God. It's a description of how we do everything. And one of the things that's really fun about this system is it's a way to organize knowledge, which you're going to see today in terms of how we organize the tarot. But you can organize any knowledge this way. Once you learn the Tree of Life, I forget, I think it was Jeff and I had a conversation one time. It was funny. And I always say, me and numbers. I have a hard time like remembering numbers. So I have a speed dial, and you have 10 speed dial numbers, right? And so the way that I remember who's what number is I put it on the Tree of Life. So 2 is my husband John because, of course, 2 is the primal or primordial masculine. He's the male head of the family. And then 3 is my son Justin because he has a very strong Saturn, and this is ruled by the planet Saturn. And 4 is Hesed. It's all about authority, and it's all about structure, so it's the number for my center. And 5, which is Gavra, which is the one sense, could be the warrior, is my son Ariel, who's a martial artist, and so on and so forth. How I remember phone numbers. You could put anything on the Tree of Life, but here's what we're going to put on it. So you could scribble this on this drawing, it's probably a good idea. All the aces belong to number 1, to Keter. So just put aces. And then I'll describe what that is in a minute. All the 2s belong to number 2, Hakma. All the 3s belong to number 3, and it's sort of stupid after this, but you might as well put them on anyway. The 4s belong to Hesed, number 4. The 5s belong to Gevurah. By the way, pronunciation is complicated too because there are 2 systems of Hebrew pronunciation. I use Ashkenazic, which is the more common Israeli version. But some people use Sephardic, so you will hear people say these words differently, and it doesn't mean they're wrong. They just may be using a different dialect. Tiferet is number 6, and all the 6s go to that. The 7s go to Netzach, number 7. The 8s go to Hud. The 9s to Yesod, which is number 9. And finally, all the 10s go to Malkut. So that's kind of easy. So right away, there are all of your lesser arcana. Right there. And then we'll talk about the court cards in a little while.
These
On
are
the-
all lesser arcana?
Yes,
these
so
are all
the lesser arcana, again, being the
Minor.
suits.
right.
The 4
Okay.
suits, right? So for example, if we were to look at the 2s, you know, you have a 2 of cups, a 2 of wands, a 2 of swords, and a 2 of pentacles, and they all go on Chokmah. And so we'll talk about that and how that works. On the pathways that connect these little round circles, which by the way are called Sephirah, what connects those are where your trumps go. So as you begin to understand what the Sephirah are, then you can begin to make some more sense of that. Now, the page right after this actually has them put right on the tree. Okay, so this is your cheat sheet. And it'll take you a while to remember where all these guys are, believe me. It took me at least a decade, I think. So, and you'll see the 0 go to the very top of the tree where there's Keter, and it's coming down toward the right to the second sphere. And you see there's a 0 in the middle of the path, there's a card, that's the Fool. Does everybody see that? Right. Go on to the opposite. There's number 1, the Magus or the Magician. And then if you look at the crossbar that connects the second and the third Sephirah, there's number 3, the Empress. And so on and so forth. What's fun about this is that as you begin to understand the Sephirah, then it gives you another whole layer of meaning to the cards. So, for example, if we look at the pathway that connects Tiferet, which is that spear right in the center, number 6, right in the center of the tree, and then there's a path that crosses the invisible Sephirah, crosses the abyss, all the way up to Keter, which is, you know, higher consciousness. The card that connects that is the High Priestess. And the High Priestess represents that moment or that state of being in which one must cross through the abyss and leave behind, in a sense, the world as most people know it. It's samadhi, it's a profoundly mystical moment in which one is able, by crossing through the abyss and leaving behind all worldly concerns, to become united with the unity of all things. And what's funny about it is that each of these pathways also has a Hebrew letter. The Hebrew letter for this is Gimel, the camel. And so for a long time, I would say to myself, Gimel, the camel, the camel. How is a camel like a high priestess? Couldn't figure that one out. And then one day I was reading this crazy Tom Robbins novel that had this picture of, you remember the picture on the old Camel cigarettes? That had the pyramid and the camel and the moon. And anyway, he was going on some riff about that. And suddenly, voila, the light bulb went off. Oh, a camel crosses the abyss, the desert, and it does it by carrying its water within it. The High Priestess is about how we have within us this kernel of inner enlightenment, and when we cross the abyss, if we sustain ourselves with that, it blossoms and we become united with one. So, that's the abyss. Oh, I hate this chalk. It's such bad chalk. All right, so first of all, there are 4 worlds in this tree of life. The first world is called Atziluth and is attributed to fire. And then we have the second world, which is called Bria. And this is water. In various places, you're going to see this notation throughout your notes. I would encourage you to learn the notation. So fire is an upward pointing triangle. Water is a downward pointing triangle. The reason why you want to learn this is that as you begin to study metaphysics more and more, it's a shorthand. Saves you a lot of time. Just the same way, like, who wants to write out Jupiter all the time? It's much easier to simply do that. Who wants to write out sun? And this is all in your notes. All that notation is in your notes. So, but I'm going to use all of it so that you don't get lost today. So here's our second world, Bria, water. And then the third world, Yetzirah, is air. Now here's where it gets interesting. So we have fire, we have water, downward pointing. Now we have an upward pointing triangle with a line through it. And that's air. And the final one is earth, right? And earth is a downward pointing triangle with a line through it. And this is called Asaya. So we have 4 worlds: fire, water, air, earth. And this is where it gets kind of interesting. So this goes back to the whole notion of how things come into being. Fire is the impulse. It's the spark. It's the big bang, in a sense. It's that moment of movement toward creation. Fire, the one, the unity. So Keter, which is on your little sheet, is the one, undifferentiated energy, and it represents total potential. So that would be like the universal mind, the mind of God, before creation occurs. Then God has a thought, an idea, an urge to create, which comes down to here, Hokmah. And this, Hokmah, is the actual first spark moving into being. And in the Bible, they talk about it as logos. So it's like the first activity, in a sense. That then has to ground itself into the feminine. So here's our Trinity that you see in every religion, in a sense. The Father, the Mother, the Holy Spirit. There it is. And so it has to ground itself, and this is the first planet. This is Saturn. The first form, the archetype of form. So you have an impulse to create, then you have an idea of what you want that creation to be. That's this world. The world of archetypes. When Plato talks about the world of archetypes, that everything has an underlying idea behind it, this is what he's talking about. Okay? So that's the realm there of water, the second world. Then that has to begin to express itself, to take on characteristics. So you have a plan, and then the plan has to begin to work itself out into the details. This is air, Yetzirah, the world of formation. And then finally, all of that coalesces into the creation, earth, the manifestation. There it is, the manifestation. One of the ways that I always think about this is you have a star, that's fire. It's burning in the cold vastness of space, which is water, the abyss. That then, through a process of heat and water interacting, forms the steam, which begins to form atmosphere. And then you have a whole eon where a planet begins to come into being, and then it finally cools down to the point where it's a planetoid. Now we have Earth. It's brilliant. Ancient thinkers actually were thinking about how the world came into being. And what's fascinating is the more and more and more we learn, the more we study quantum physics, the more we see that this map of reality is absolutely accurate. All right, so now we have these 4 elements, and going back to the cards, one of the things that you can do is you can talk about, the suits as being associated with the 4 worlds, but you can also think about the court cards that way. So The way it works is, and this is somewhere in your notes, the next page, I believe. Yeah, the kings, maybe it isn't on this page. All right, well, let's just do it now. The kings are associated with fire. The queens are associated with water.
Kings with fire, you said?
Kings with fire.
Student of up.
Yeah. So the kings are associated with fire. The queens are associated with water. The knight, or in some decks, the knight is called a prince. And in the playing cards, it would be the jack, right? The knight is associated with air. Now, the normal playing card deck drops the page or the princess. Interesting. But we have it in the older form of playing cards, the tarot. The pages in the princess are associated with earth. So now we have a really interesting thing. I hate to erase that. All right, I don't want to erase that. So you have the 4 suits. Each of them is associated with an element: earth, air, fire, water, right? Now, for the court cards, which we're going to talk about at much more length later, but just to give you a quick kind of fast forward here for a second. If you think about earth, air, fire, water, and you know a little bit about astrology, you'll know that we have the 4 elements in astrology, right? So you have fire signs, right? So wands would be your fire signs, okay? Now you have king, queen, and prince or knight, right? The kings are what we call cardinal. So the king of wands is cardinal fire. Cardinal fire is Aries. This is in your notes. So it is in your notes. You won't have to memorize it. Where that is actually, yeah, last page. There it is. So yeah, let's turn it to that. So what we have is, we have kings are cardinal, queens are fixed, or sometimes called cherubic, and the knights are mutable. So that's what's called a triplicity. What does that mean? Well, cardinal means the energy of whatever suit it is in its beginning. So cardinal fire is the most fiery, in a sense. It's that beginning fire, like Aries. People who are Aries are great at beginning stuff. They're the guys who get projects off the ground, right? They're leaders. When they lead people in a new direction. That would be, of course, our cardinal fire. Fixed fire is where the energy is really at its most stable and it's at its height. Leo.
Okay.
Leos.
Would you mind if you explain cardinal?
Cardinal means
Cardinal.
beginning.
Oh, beginning.
Think about it as beginning. Okay? Beginning fire. Or beginning earth. Or beginning, because every suit has a cardinal, right? Every suit has a fixed, meaning it's at its height. And then mutable is where it's still that energy, but now it's starting to flip into something else. Which is why mutable signs are the most changeable of the signs, right? So you have cardinal, fixed, and mutable fire. Cardinal, fixed, and mutable. That's what we call triplicities. So that's where we get the king of earth, king of pentacles, right? Is cardinal earth. It's Capricorn. The queen of pentacles, fixed earth, Taurus, the bull. Ever tried to budge a Taurian? Because earth is very stable, right? And when you combine it with fixed, you know. On the other hand, a fixed, when you take the fixed sign in water being very flowy, that's kind of nice. What you have is stable emotionality. We like that, right? Mutable earth, it would be the knight, and that would be Virgo. So if you're doing a reading and the Knight of Pentacles shows up, might be a Virgo somewhere in there, you know? right? So we'll talk about that. But this just gives you how you can figure out these court cards. So, and then you can see it just follows through. So if you have the king, which is cardinal of cups, the king of cups would be Cancer, right? Oh, that isn't fixed. Scorpio's fixed. Ooh. Yeah, Scorpios are interesting. So, and then you have the Queen of Cups, that's Scorpio, because that's fixed. And then you have the Knight, which is mutable. Now that's an interesting thing. When you take a mutability and you combine it with water, which is very flowy, the problem with Pisceans is they are all over the map. You know, they never know what they're feeling. They're all over the place. And they're funny. They have a lot of feelings, but they're constantly changing. If a Piscean is having a bad feeling, tell them, don't worry, 5 minutes from now you'll be feeling something else. Yes. So, I should not make that joke, but anyway. All right, then, and we'll go on. So, King of Wands, that's cardinal fire. We talked about that. It's Aries. Great at beginning stuff. Leo, which is fixed fire. I love Leos. But, you know, Leos are so warm and they have such hot, constant energy. But, boy, do they never shut down. Try to get a Leo to go to bed. Unless, of course, they're having fun. Anyway, the Knight of Wands would be Sagittarius. It's mutable. And Sagittarians are very fiery, but they're very mutable. So they're far easier to get to change and to talk to than other fire signs because that mutability makes them very flexible. They're very interested in new ideas, Sagittarians. And then we have air. The king of cardinal air is Libra. And then you have queen, which is fixed air, Aquarius. Aquarians are really interesting because they just completely march to their own beat. You know, when their mind is just, nothing distracts them. They're really amazing. And then you have mutable air. Again, air is very fluctuating anyway, and you combine it with mutability and you get Gemini, the twins, and you never know with the Gemini. They're 1 minute they're this way and the next minute they're that way. So this gives you a way to sort of think about the court cards, and we'll come back and do them. We're going to cover each of these at length. And then let's go and look at the princesses, or the pages as they're called. These are the elements. So you have the page of pentacles is earth of earth. The page of cups is earth of water. The page of wands is earth of fire. This is on that same page. And the page of swords is earth of air. Usually the pages show up in readings as being opportunities or the beginning of a particular energy. So these represent the opportunity to manifest one of the elements in your life. So if your page of pentacle comes up, it shows that you're probably going to get some opportunities around money, finances, that sort of thing. New job, new house. The page of cups would be maybe new emotional experiences, new relationships. The page of swords might indicate the opportunity to learn something new or to expand your horizon. And the page of wands, the opportunity to expand your power base, kind of flex your muscles and that sort of thing. So there you go. And then again, I said similarly, the kings in general represent fire. So the king of wands is fire of fire. It's a very fiery card. When your king of wands shows up, if you're not actually interpreting it as a person, then you would say, whoa, there's a really strong energy for getting things done here. And the queens represent water, so the queen of pentacles would be water of earth. That's a very interesting thing. I always think of the queen of pentacles as being, the great nourishing mother, because you have the emotionality of water linked to acting in the realm of earth. So it's nourishment. It's the great mother, the nourishing woman. The mama who's in the kitchen making the split pea soup. That's the queen of pentacles, right? And then you have things like the knights represent air. So the knight of cups would be air of water. And that's a beautiful a beautiful card. It's the card of the quester. You see a knight on a horse carrying a cup, and there's this mental quality that is expressing itself in the realm of emotion. So this is about a kind of passionate attachment to ideals. So that's just a kind of a quick overview of how these court cards work. All right, let's go back to the tree. So now what do we have on the tree? We know where the court cards are, we know where the trumps are, and we know where the lesser arcana are, right? All right. Now let's talk about the individual spheres or sephira, because that's going to give you an understanding of the numbers. All right. So the first sephira is called Keter. It's actually, THs are pronounced like a T in the Ashkenazic. So when you see a TH at the end of the word, of the word, like say Tiferet, it's pronounced Tiferet, right? And Keter rather than Kether. But again, who cares, you know? Kether is the point. It's the undifferentiated energy. It's total potential. So the aces live up here. And what that means is that the ace represents total potential energy in whatever suit it is. So if it's the ace of pentacles, it's great potential for physical gain, physical manifestation. If it's the ace of cups, it's great potential for emotional expansion and experiences. Did you see what I'm saying? Ace of swords, it's great potential for new ideas. The problem with the ones is that it's all potential. So depending on where you are in a particular context or particular reading, that could be a good thing or a bad thing. If somebody's like at a point in a project where they're supposed to be really like, hammering down the details, and the ace shows up, maybe not so good, right? On the other hand, in the beginning, when aces show up when somebody's entering into a new period, it really tells you that there's going to be some rapid growth in that particular area. So those are the ones and those are the aces. So aces are about this incredible potentiality. 2, Chokmah. This is the first spark, the first movement into being. So the twos are all going to be about the beginning. The very beginning. Often the beginning in the sense that it's still kind of conceptual. It hasn't actually started to take on form yet. So then you just apply it to whatever suit you have, right? So again, just as a review, Pentacles is going to be about the physical. So twos and Earth sort of is like the beginning, or really just beginning to get an impulse to start some new venture. The Two of Wands, the impulse to act. You know how you have that moment where you're just like, you just have that, you feel like, whoa, I want to do something, I'm not sure what yet, but I can feel it, right? That would be the 2. The 3s. This is where energy begins to take on a stable form. It's not yet this is the first form. The 3s are the first form. It's more of an idea. So this is when you begin to ground an idea into sort of a template or a plan in a sense. And this is attributed, now we're going to get into some planets. And by the way, I did give you a nice little handout here that has the planets, it has their symbols and what they mean. So let's go to that now for a moment. Binah, which is ruled by Saturn. Okay, so if you look on the bottom of that page number 1, there's our lovely little glyph. Saturn is mostly done sort of like that. There's the really older form is a little fancier, but we're not going to bother with that. So, and what is it? It's kind of interesting. It has a vertical line, which represents activity, crossed by a horizontal line, which means that it's kind of passive. It's not yet doing anything. So that's right away is a kind of a push-pull. So Saturn is the urge to manifest, but it's slow. And then it's over a moon. This is actually a crescent moon. And what that has to do with is receptivity, but it's receptivity going downward. So this is the urge to manifest in physical form, which is why Saturn is always attributed to solid things like the bones, the teeth, you know? And Saturn, so here we have this wonderful idea that's now having to kind of take on a form. And so Saturn is also containing energy. And what's interesting about that, I love this, one of the cards that you'll see, if you look in our Lesser Arcana cards, let's look at the Three of, what is it? Swords. That would be on page 6, where it says it's 6 of 7. Three of Swords. Okay, everybody looks at that and they go, ugh. Ugh, I don't like that. You know, what's that? Well, here's the thing. Thought is open. But when you get over to here, where you have to begin to form a plan, Saturn means that now that thought has to be contained and limited. Do you know what I mean? So in the beginning, when you're first feeling an impulse to do something, you could move in multiple directions. But when you actually start to move over here and form a plan, then you have to say, well, I got to get rid of that part, and I got to get rid of this part, and maybe that part will work, and this has to be modified. So suddenly, you have to begin limiting. You have to begin saying, this is important, this isn't. And that's why it's a heart pierced by swords, because there's a way where, you know, the gain is you actually start to get a plan, and the loss is you have to give some stuff up to get there. Right? So it's sort of like what's going on, although it's sort of horrifying where it's gone. But if we think about, you know, what's been going on with the National Health Care Plan, you know, in order to like get somewhere, to get to some sort of plan, they have to start chopping out all sorts of things and adding others, and you know, that's that painful part of the process. So Saturn is difficult and essential. So again, this is a positive thing, I think, even though it doesn't often feel positive. So the Three of Swords is all about the fact that your thought has to become a little bit ruthless at this stage. You have to say, well, that was a lovely idea, but have you ever worked in a committee? Oh God. Yeah, well, committee work is like binah to the nth degree, you know? And then, you know, and there's always a push-pull because, you know, somebody's cherished notion has to get booted to the side, you know, because it just doesn't quite fit. So those are your threes are about that. Now the Three of Swords, we often experience that as difficult. The Three of Cups, on the other hand, is kind of great. And what that's about is, okay, it's that containment, but let's look at the Three of Cups. You see the dancing figures. I believe that's on the preceding page. Yeah. So you see these three graces, you know, dancing around with the cups. And it's very interesting when we get in the Saturnian solidity and containment actually works well in the realm of water. It provides a container. And that's about how, you know, when you're floating out there, you have endless possibilities in relationships. But when you actually begin to move into the early stage of commitment, it feels good, right? Things get more intense. They get more contained. This is like the beginning of the romance, right? It actually, and you all know what a rush that is, right? Unfortunately, then later on, you get to divorce. And now suddenly, you know, what was that glorious rush of contained feelings becomes ho hum, now we have a relationship and we have our routines. Right? So it's really funny how that works.
Can I ask, but like on the flip side of that, Three of Cups could also also mean sort of like the fear, like the flip side of that could be like fear of commitment?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely. And it could be, or it could be an addiction to that stage of relationship. You know, there are some people who never seem to get past they're addicted to, you know, that really strong initial early phase relationship, and then they don't want to get out of it. They want to stay in the romance forever.
Right.
Right. So, but it's a romance that hasn't grounded itself yet.
Okay.
It's all about the idea of we could live together forever, we could be soulmates, we could be but we haven't started arguing about who's doing the dishes. You know, we haven't gotten there yet. It's all still in the realm of the creative, you know, archetypal, Briatic world, right? Then what happens is we cross the abyss. And now we get down to 4, which is we set up housekeeping, so our two lovers move in together, and then you discover that, you know, he squeezes the toothpaste tube from the middle, or, you know, she always leaves her underwear on the floor. Alas. You know, the beauty of the archetypal world fades all too fast when we get to the 4s. But so you see how you have what the number itself means, and then you have to look at what it's like when it funnels through that realm of activity, the emotional, the physical, and so on. So, and like if we look, let's say, for example, that we look at the 3 of Pentacles. Oh, I'm getting ahead of myself, but oh well. Yeah, there we go. So that's a little bit hard to understand. This is one reason why, by the way, I really want to ground you in this conceptual system, because these pictures will only take you so far. You know, they're good as a little cheat sheet, and mini decks don't even have the pictures for the Lesser Arcana. They just have like 3 swords or 3 pentacles, right? But the iconography behind this card is it's basically a journeyman presenting his finished work. So this is a card that has its roots in the medieval guild system. So first you start off as an apprentice, and you know, you knock around and you do a little bit of everything, and then you actually become a journeyman and you start to do work. And when you get to the point where you've actually have reached a level where you can do not a master work, but a good, solid journeyman piece of work, you know, then when you reach the point where you could actually, I should say, that's when you do a master work. At the very end of the journeyman, where you have to, it's just like a dissertation. You have to produce a body of work that is truly original. That's a master work. And then you become a master. So this is the journeyman. He's done his work, and now he's getting ready to really go out and do stuff in the world. So what that's about is the 3, when you take it into the realm of Pentacles, that tends to be a fairly happy card. Like I said, there's always a positive and a negative. This one tends to be pretty positive because Saturn and Earth go together really well. So the kind of containment of Saturn, the kind of weeding out of the unnecessary, the winnowing down details, that sort of energy means that by the time you get through that process, then you're really ready to go out. You have a solid plan. You can go out and do something, right? So this tends to be a pretty positive card. And it means that a person's really, okay, so if it shows up in a reading, you say, okay, so I think you've got a pretty good plan in place, you know? The negative might be, so what would the negative be? Well, the negative might be if a person gets into this place and then they actually have to leave. And I always think the negative on the 3 of Cups is like the person who finishes their dissertation or doesn't. It could be getting stuck in that moment where you're really ready to move on, but you can't really quite put the final piece in place because you don't want to leave the university. Yeah, anyway, that's the 3 of That would be the Three of Pentacles in a negative sense, you know, but it tends to be a positive card. But it could be that a person is sticking at that point, right? So that's the threes. Let's go on. The fours. Is this making sense? I haven't lost anybody yet? Okay. If it sounds like total gibberish, just let me know. All right. Moving on to the floors. So now we've gone from a point to a line, right? To a plane, and now we're on to a solid, a square. We now have 4 dimensions. This is energy. Fours are about energy in a stable form. Laws, rules, law rules, order prevails. It's also about a building up. It's a surge of energy for building up. The planet associated with this is Jupiter, right? And there again, there's a moon on a cross. So this is receptivity, and it's fixed energy. So this is Jupiter. Think about Jupiter, or as Zeus, the Greek king of the gods. And you get this. This is about authority. This is about stability. This is about building up energy, empire, you know. And there again, you have to take it into whatever suit it is. So for example, you know, again, the Four of Pentacles, that tends to be a pretty happy pairing, because stability and Earth is a good thing. We all like to be financially stable. Most of us don't like, you know, runaway markets. A little scary, right? You know, we like our home life to be pretty stable. Of course, it can get too stable, and then we start accumulating. You know, one of the problems with Jupiter is it can be about accumulation as well. So, you know, I always think of like a Four of Pentacles could also be a person who has, you know, one of those people who has their house so full of stuff that you have to like walk in a little trail through the rooms. That could be a Four of Pentacles, you bet. Then you also have, you know, on the other hand, you have something like the Four of Cups. I think I talked about this earlier. Emotionality doesn't like to be held in stable form so much. So that's the thing where now we've gone from the lovely romance to, you know, now we have all of our little routines, and sometimes we feel confined. Sometimes it gets a little ho-hum. So one of this is actually one of the cards that I sort of think is fun to look at. Look at the Four of Cups for just a moment. And there you see it. So there's this seated figure sitting on the ground, and he's even being offered a cup from the clouds, from the heavens, you know. And he's like, yeah. You know, it's discontent, right? So that's how this card can manifest. But not always. This can be a positive card too, in that it can be a pause in relationship where one has to reassess. Is this really what I want? Is this structure working? Because of course in the first blast of emotion, it all seems just swell. But then when you have to actually, you know, put two people in a yoke and they have to go in the same direction, then, you know, you begin to discover that maybe it was a great idea, but it isn't working out so well, you know? So this could be a pause for reflection in relationship. That would be the fours. Fours is, and this Jupiterian energy is really about ordering and building up. It's a very creative energy, and it can also get a little out of hand. And like, who was I talking to yesterday? It was really funny. Yeah, here's a Jupiter run amok. So she decided to organize her closets, and so she organizes first by colors, and then by the shirts. All the shirts of one color, but then it had to be all the shirts of one color by brand. Wow, you know, yeah, right. And then I was just, whoa, you know, I'm a Virgo. I like organization, but boy, that was like, whoa, right? So what happens? Well, then what happens is to every action there is a reaction. And so fives is the pentagon, the pentagram. Fives are about breaking up stasis, individuation, and revolution. So the fives are all about like, and so the fives are often considered negative cards. I don't think they are. No card is negative in and of itself, but they often look kind of negative because they're always about shaking stuff up, right? So, you had this nice little, happy relationship, and you moved in together, and you bought a house together, and then, the shit hits the fan. Excuse my French, but Gabara, and then suddenly it's like, oh boy, you sort of, the reality sets in where there's this impulse now to break free. But what's good about the fives always is that it's breaking up a form in order to allow some more movement. And this is often rather uncomfortable, but it's not a bad thing. It's really not a bad thing. And we'll talk about that at length when we talk about the cards, because I think the fives are more challenging than most.
Okay, is
Yeah.
there a meaning to the word like pentagon, solid, point? Is that something we're going to learn later? Or does it have a
Probably
meaning?
not. Well, maybe I'll get around to talking about it, but that just has to do with the geometric form associated with it. And you'll notice it just becomes, after you get to the fours, which is a square or a cube,
Mhm.
you then move on to just 5-sided figures, 6-sided, 7-sided, 8-sided, 9-sided. So, one could talk about that, but unfortunately, with the Tree of Life, there's so much one could talk about.
Okay.
We'll try to get through as much of it as we can. So, and here at this point, I want to stop and pause for a moment in our little journey down the tree. And I want to point out that we have something here called 3 pillars. We have this pillar, which is called the pillar of mercy. And we have this pillar, which is called the pillar of severity. And I believe that's on your color, that gorgeous color drawing has that. Yeah, there we go. They're also known as Boaz and Joachim. Who cares? You don't need to know that. This is associated with positive, we could say male. I hate that term. I would rather say yang. But, and the reason why I would rather say yang is that in the West, we have a persistent problem when we use the term male and female because we tend to associate it with gender. And when we're talking about ideas, that's not helpful, actually. And so that's where we fall into all sorts of goofy things like thinking of, male gods on this side of the tree, or that this is like men are more like this and women are more like that. And it's not true. Gods are essentially androgynous. They're both male and female, as are human beings, as are ideas, as are everything. But at any rate, well, let's talk about it as active, as positive, yang, and this side is more feminine, yin, passive, and negative. And again, by negative, I don't mean it in the sense of bad. I mean negative in the sense of electrical polarity. You have a positive and a negative pole, right? And this gets to be sort of interesting because, and then we have the middle pillar. This is the pillar of equilibrium. And the middle pillar is balance. So, and interestingly enough, like, this is a tangent, so I'm not going to go there, but for more than 1 minute. There's a whole chakra system that arises out of this in Hermeticism. It's called, this is the 5 chakra system, and so here's the crown and the third eye. This is the throat. This is the heart, solar plexus. This is the belly. This is the root. It does coincide with the Vedic system. But at any rate, this is the middle pillar. It's balanced. All of the cards, all the sephira on the middle pillar tend to be more harmonious and more positive just because they're balanced. When you get on either side, you tend to have more imbalance. And the further down the tree it is, the closer to manifestation it is, the more problematic it is. So if you think about a building and you think about a foundation, if you have a little crack somewhere higher up in the building, it doesn't probably cause a big problem. A crack in the foundation, big problem, right? So one of the things that's really interesting is the further you get down the tree, the more these imbalances become. So in other words, the 2s and the 3s tend to be a little more positive, a little more. That's not that they can't be read negatively, but they tend to be probably a little more positive. Down here, the 7s and the 8s tend to be a little bit more problematic. Except, you have to remember in the context of the reading. So for example, if somebody is in the late stages of something that they're working on, and they really should be like coming around to, bringing something to fruition, and they get a bunch of cards up here, that's probably not so good, right? And on the other hand, if you get too many 7s and 8s when somebody is in an initiating period where they're just starting, probably they're getting ahead of themselves, right? And then this is kind of in the middle. This is in the middle of the tree, right? So that's an interesting thing. Then you also have these polarities. So you have the 2 sides of the trees. You have the top, the bottom. All right, we're gonna go on with that some more. Let's go back for a moment, though, just and fill in our planets, just so that it's easier for you. So go to your little blank Kabbalah tree, and
what planet is associated with 5s?
that's what I was just going to tell you. Thank you. Mars. So we have Saturn, Jupiter, Mars, Sun, then we get down here, we have Mercury. Whoops, sorry, screwed up. We have Venus. Venus is the symbol we all know. It's the symbol for women. And then over here we have Mercury. Then here we have Moon. And then we have Earth. Earth is represented as a circle with a cross. The 4 elements, right? In manifestation.
Yeah, sorry, can you review 1, 2, and 3?
Yeah. 1 is the all.
Oh, Saturn.
And one way you can think about it is the Tao. It's the all. No planet. There's a lot of argument about this. Some systems want to say it's Uranus, others Neptune. I think probably the best way of viewing it is, how do I want to say it? Don't give it a planet. It's just confuse you. Think about this as primordial force. And then what happens is when that primordial force, which is emanated from the all, finally begins to come over here to Binah, it begins to take on the first idea of form, Saturn. And then as it crosses the abyss, it begins to take on the other planets, each of which contributes something. This contributes the building up, it contributes structure, ordering. This kind of shakes things up and gives vitality. authenticity, drive, and so on. We'll continue on. All right, so the fives are Mars. It's about and if you think about Mars energy, you know, it can be destructive and warlike. So it balances. This is all about build up, build up, build up. This is all about, oh, let's shake it up a little. And what you really want is a balance between those two forces, right? That's what we all need, is a balance between those two forces. So, but what happens is we go through our stages as we go toward manifesting. So we begin to really create a structure, but then we have to shake it up. We have to rethink it. We have to make sure that it hasn't strayed too far from our first idea, right? And so this is a downward reflection. This is a downward reflection of this. In other words, Mars, what happens is you have an idea, and to get to that idea, you have to be a little bit ruthless. You have to cut away the inessential. You have to say what's really central here, right? Then you go through some building up and some creation, and you're trying it out and you're playing with it. And then you come over here and you have to go through some more weeding out. Clean it up. What didn't work? How do I have to fix this? You know? And so there's a kind of cyclical nature to that. And so when somebody's in one of the fives, you know that there's some kind of house cleaning going on here, which could be experienced as devastating and awful and really hard, or it may be a huge relief. You know, like, so somebody who's very, very repressed and has been, you know, in a system where they're like in a straitjacket and they hit a bunch of fives come up in a reading, it's like, yippee, let it out, let it roll, you know, whoa, let's rock. So that's good, right? So it can be good, it can be bad. It kind of depends. It depends on what you need and where you're at, right? Then we come back into the middle. That's always beautiful. The sixes are almost always positive. It's very hard to get a negative read on a six because they're so harmonious. The only time that I ever get negative about sixes is sometimes they can represent complacency. You know, where you're just having your moment in the sun and everything's so lovely that you don't see that you know, Molotov cocktail is headed toward your head, you know, because you're really having your moment, woohoo, you know. But mostly the sun is about identity, and it's about things being balanced and being in harmony, and so the sixes are pretty good. The heart. Then we come down again, out of balance, over to, I love this sphere, the seven. And the sevens can be really problematic, but God, I love this sphere. This is Netzach, and it's Venus. Okay, so first of all, we have to like get rid of our sort of cultural ideas about Aphrodite, okay? Because Aphrodite is sort of an airhead, right? And Venus is much more than that. Well, actually, she's not an airhead, but as we understand her in Bullfinch's mythology, she's an airhead. Actually, Aphrodite is the great awakener. Venus is the energy of inspiration, of being awakened to a vision of beauty. When somebody is really in touch with this sphere and the energy is pouring through them, they are often bigger than life. These are people who have a mission. These are the Gandhis, the Martin Luther Kings. These are people who have a tremendous vision. And the positive of it is just precisely that. It's being in touch with a real vision. And the negative is, you gotta ground it. You know? So the sevens can be tricky because, so for example, when you get the seven of pentacles, which if you look at your picture, it's on page 5. The seven of pentacles, you see the guy in his garden, leaning on his hoe, contemplating his plant. Okay, well, the positive, what does that represent? Well, it represents a pause in action, in actual work, in making the garden, in order to get in touch with your vision. Now, that might be a good thing. Or it might be you know, you're so busy like having your little fantasy that you just don't get out there and hoe the damn thing, right? So that's an interesting card, you know, and it would depend on context, you know. So for example, if you're in a reading where there are a lot of cards pointing to the fact that the person needs to actually kind of stop and remember what they're about and what, that would be a good time to see that card. Then I would go, oh, okay, this is good. This is a pause in action while you are actually reflecting on your original vision. But on the other hand, you know, if it's like now, you know, it's time to really roll your sleeves up and get the wall painted, you don't want to see that card, right? So that's the problem, the beauty of the sevens and the curse of the sevens. So it's all about vision. But you have to see, you know, where it is in the realm of things. So, for example, the Seven of Cups, which is on the next page, you see the guy standing in front of all the cups with all these strange and mysterious and fabulous looking objects. And again, that would strongly depend on context. But one is somewhat inclined to view that as being lost in the vision of all these wonderful possibilities. We all know people like this, right? Never get a darn thing done, you know? Now, there are moments when this can be clearly a positive card, but it's not so likely, yeah.
So could that be like a lower vibration of a 3?
Yes,
Something like
absolutely beautiful, yes.
that?
It is, because this was your original idea, and then this is the passion that fuels your action, okay? But yeah, it should be, if this is not connected to that, you're in trouble. You know, and that does happen where people get all passionate about, they're in love with some vision they have, but they've forgotten like what they're really doing. You know what I mean? They've fallen in love with it for its own sake. Not a good thing. That's a disjunct, not a good thing, right? And all these things reflect back and forth, right? So, and here again, if we look at this tree, this side of the tree, just the pillar of mercy, and let's go down it for a second. So we have an impulse to act, and then the next thing down is it begins to build itself up into structures. And then those structures then, you know, should, we hope, provide a vision and provide some support to drive us forward to the final business of manifesting. You know? So there's all of that. On this side of the tree, well, let's do this, and then we'll go down the side of the tree. So this is all about the realm of the ideal. But it's more up here, this is about the actual sort of plan. This is more about the emotion that makes us hang in there, right? So in other words, you could have, let's say Martin Luther King or Gandhi. So Gandhi had a vision of a free India, okay? And what happened then, he also got in touch with his own passion to make that vision come forth. And one of the things that also happens is people can have a strong vision and they lack the passion. So they burn out or they run out of steam. Right? So NetSoc is really about that emotional drive that drives us forward. And again, there's a pole. So this is about, you know, that inspired passion. And this is about inspired thought. You have to have both, right? So this is, yes, I'm going to make that happen, and this is how I'm going to do it. Mercury, thought, both. Mercury, the how-to, the plan. So this is that plan now really being nailed down. really taking on concrete form, right? So, and again, you have to have a balance between these two things. So the 8s are generally about force, how you apply stuff. So it's a kind of a mental pattern. Now, if you look at your sheet that I gave you, when we talk about it, NetSoc and Hood, at this point, I'm moving into the more negative aspect of it because it is lower down on the tree. But I would encourage you to also remember there's the positive. So, you have at NetSoc, it can be imbalanced at the lower level. Dissipation of force, the ideal that lies behind a manifestation on the plane of personality. That's the positive. The negative is if you lose your steam because you're getting too dreamy. Right? Or you're somehow cut off from it. Right? And whereas HUD is a reaction to NetSoc, it can be, in a negative sense, a misapplication of force or knowledge. So, like, if you think in the realm of literature, Mary Shelley's book Frankenstein is all about a misfiring of HUD, of where the scientist runs amok, where he has lost touch with, he's just doing because he can, right? So this is the how to, this is the why to, and you got to have them together. So the funny thing about the 8s are, if we look at some of them 8s, let's see, let's look at the 8 of Swords. That's one of my favorites. So now you have thought, and you have this, all this plan, this whole plan, but you see that the person has become tied up, blindfolded, and bound. So this is a representation of the negative of the card, where you've become the prisoner of your idea, and you've forgotten the whole ideal realm that lies behind it. That's one of the meanings of that card. Another way that I look at that card, though, is that it's where we become the prisoner of our own thoughts, and we don't realize, and so what happens is we talk ourselves into or out of things. I can't do it. I must do it, right? And but it's not real, because the person feels bound and blindfolded, and yet power is all around them. Swords are all around them. So this can be like where one is not really, one's thoughts are not being helpful. And with the wands, you see a similar thing. You see a bunch of wands flying through the air, and it's usually symbolic of that kind of activity where you're just in movement and you're just doing, but you're just doing because you can, and you're not thinking about what you're doing. And so often it doesn't go anywhere because it's no longer has a motive force or a guiding force, right? That would be the negative. And then finally we get back to balance. Okay, before we go there, let's go down the tree again on this side. So on this pillar of severity. It's called the pillar of severity because this is all about fine-tuning. So you have an idea, you start to get it in gear, and then you need to prune. I always think about 5s as being like pruning. So, I have an idea in my garden, now it's growing and I've got to prune it. And then, Mercury, this is where, hopefully the garden is actually finally working and producing. And I have to gather my fruit, and I have to make sure I do stuff at the right time. Boy, I'll tell you, a great metaphor for this would be being an orchardist. Growing fruit trees is just a nightmare. It really is, because there's so many things you have to do. So, you start off, you have this lovely idea, I want to have fruit. And then, you plant the darn trees. And then you have to prune them and shape them, and you have to spray them at the right time, and you have to, even with the natural stuff, you have to fertilize them, and then you have to pick the apples at exactly the right moment, and a lot of work. There'd be Mercury. So there's this translation both up and down the tree. But again, if you get stuck over here or stuck over here, things don't work too well. So we always need to have a balance, right? Now, moving back to the balance, to the middle pillar, we come to the nines, which is the moon. Think about that as the final template behind manifestation. It's like where you've done all these things, you put your plan in place, now you've got the final, all the details are in place. And then boom, you have your product. And so usually the nines represent kind of the final culmination of a suit. Generally the nines are pretty positive. But not always. And so what's interesting is when you look at the different suits, the nine of swords is the most tricky in that it's the most likely to be negative. And that's because, you know, right before the moment of manifestation, if you go to the thought, level of thought, there's always that moment of, is it gonna happen? Is it gonna work? Is it gonna work? Is it gonna work? You know. Right. Whereas with emotions, you know, the Nine of Cups usually, woohoo! I'm happy. Everything's good. All right. And then finally we get to the final, and this is the plane of manifestation, Asaya. Now we get to the final Malkut, the final sphere. And what we have here is manifestation. The death of force into form. The thing has happened. So the tens are really about when something's ending or something has arrived. And therein lies the tale. Because on the one hand, so if you're going through, let's say, cups, and you have all these, and it's a relationship reading. It's really about relationship. You come up with the 10 of cups. It's usually a marriage card. Okay, you're gonna get married. You know, that's it. You did it. It's complete. That's a positive. But the problem about the completion is when something completes, it's like a life. Somebody once asked my teacher Bob. He said, "Bob, how do you know when your work is done?" And Bob, in his own inimitable way, leaned forward ponderously and said, "When you hear the dirt thudding on your coffin lid." So the moment you complete is the moment you start to decay. And it's also the moment where the suits transform one into the other. So, fire, water, air, earth. You start with the wands. The 10 of wands transmutes to the ace of cups, water. The 10 of cups transmutes to the ace of swords. The 10 of swords transmutes to the ace of pentacles. You see, did you follow that? Fire becomes water, water becomes air, air becomes earth, and then you start all over again. So sometimes, so there are two ways of reading it. So there's that kind of, it's sort of like that, what is it? There's that moment that they describe, some writers describe, there's that moment, that post-orgasmic moment where there's this triste, there's this sadness. Ah, it's over, you know. So there is that in the tens. So, you know, you arrive somewhere, and sometimes the underbelly, the negative can come in because you got there and now you're like kind of ready to move on to the next thing.